Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us today. On behalf of Ethisphere, my name is Chelsea Domenico, and I'm pleased to be joined by our partners LRN for today's webcast, The Resilience Factor, How Challenges Can Strengthen Ethical Culture. We're really excited to be partnering with LRN on this pressing topic and challenges many of you are facing today. Over the next hour or so, you'll hear from expert leaders at LRN, Schein and AES Corporation, as they share insights into how they're focusing on values of trust, respect, and transparency to protect and support employees and enhance and strengthen ethical culture in the midst of today's crisis. If you've ever joined us for an Ethisphere webcast before, you know we love to take your questions. So please use the question feature you see within the Zoom platform. Our goal for every webcast is to encourage you to ask as many questions as you may have. If we do run out of time, don't worry, we'll follow up these via email afterwards. Following the live webcast, you will receive an email from me, including the recording of today's session, as well as the PowerPoint presentation. For our Bella members, this will also be uploaded to your member hub. If you need assistance with logging into the member hub or have other members of your team you'd like to access the resources, please don't hesitate to send me an email and I'd be happy to set them up. I want to quickly introduce our experts today. Leading today's conversation will be Susan Divers, Senior Advisor at LRN, and she is joined by Nancy Lannis, Vice President and Chief Compliance Officer at Schein, and Thomas Benson, Vice President and Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at AES Corporation. I'd like to now turn the floor over to to Susan. Susan, you could begin today's discussion.
Great, thank you, Chelsea. And it's a pleasure always to work with Ethisphere and Bella. And I'm sorry that this is the first year that we haven't been face-to-face in New York for the Global Ethics Summit. But I think today's webcast is a way to unite our community and to bring people together and to share insights at a time of great tragedy and challenge in the world today. So as everyone knows, the COVID crisis has provided many challenges to organizations, communities, countries, and individuals, but it's also provided some highly inspiring examples of organizations, particularly companies, that have gone well beyond the legal and regulatory requirements that apply to them and done the right thing by both employees, customers, and stakeholders. And today, we're very lucky to have Nancy and Tom, whose organizations are very committed in that regard and have provided shining examples of companies that are doing the right thing, even though it's not something that they're necessarily obliged to do. That willingness to go beyond regulatory requirements is a key difference that LRN's 2020 annual program effectiveness report has highlighted, and I'm going to get into those results in just a minute. Every year we do a survey of program effectiveness for ethics and compliance programs, and we look at cultural factors and results in the workplace rather than using a checklist. And what we're seeing overwhelmingly, particularly in this year's report, and Chelsea, if you can go to the first slide, is that it's ethical culture that makes or breaks a company in terms of how it does, particularly in times of challenge. So as I mentioned, high-performing programs, those that are highly effective in the workplace, are characterized by a willingness to go beyond law, regulation, or procedures and ask their employees to live their values. And again, you're going to hear some excellent examples of that in today's webcast. If you can go to the next one, Chelsea. What I mentioned before too was that an organization's ethical culture determines whether rules and procedures will be followed, ignored, or circumvented, no matter how thick the company rule book may be. And I think this is a real shift in realization, almost a tipping point, where the early days of ethics and compliance programs were characterized by layers of rules and more rules. And the response to an issue like the financial crisis was Sarbanes-Oxley, which I've heard weighs 35 pounds. And you need rules, you need guidance, you need regulations, you need laws. But what really makes the difference in terms of whether those procedures, rules, regulations are going to be followed is what is your ethical culture? And I'm just going to give a few highlights from this year's survey, and then we've got a link to it in the slides, and I would urge you, it's on our website, I would urge you to take a look. But what we see is that if you really want to establish, maintain, and sustain an ethical culture, it's important that your leaders at all levels model values-based behaviors and bring to life code of conduct and policies. Ethics and compliance isn't something that should just be left to the lawyers. It's basically something that is everyone's responsibility. And you're going to hear that from both Nancy and Tom today. Another key feature of a strong ethical culture and an effective program is that the organization's values permeate everywhere. As one CEO put it, it's in the drinking water. It's in the code, policies, training, in the evaluation and compensation process, and in business decision-making, which is critical. It's not just off in a corner or trotted out once a year for everybody to certify that they, in fact, will abide by the code. And as I mentioned, ethics and compliance considerations are integrated into business decisions, planning, and operations. One of the things we looked at this year in the PEI is instances of really deadly misconduct that have occurred in the last year, and the commonalities in those situations where companies with established programs and established procedures nonetheless had significant and mortal consequences from misconduct. And what you see there is that the revenue targets or the schedule priorities overcame those procedures and those rules. And there wasn't a strong enough ethical culture to counteract those pressures. And then lastly, audit, evaluation, and risk mitigation. I've really been struck by the degree to which the Department of Justice and other regulators are stressing that one size does not fit all in their view with ethics and compliance programs. Your program has to be tailored to your risks and to your risk profile, and effectively mitigate those risks, not what another company in your industry does necessarily. So let's turn to the next one. If you do that, if you really focus on your ethical culture and establish it, maintain it, strengthen it, that requires, it's not a one and done, and it's not something you can take out of a box. It basically means that your culture has to be continuously assessed and feedback has to be openly received. So we see some really interesting differences, and the whole report has a lot of these very interesting measurements and statistics. But high impact programs are 30% more likely than low impact to include ethics and compliance questions in employee engagement surveys. They're 60% more likely to include roundtable discussions about ethics and compliance. And they're 60% more likely to utilize cultural diagnostics to look at the presence or absence of factors such as trust, respect, and transparency. And these are ways of obtaining feedback that provide valuable information, and they also send a strong message to employees that they're actually being heard. And the best programs take that into account and reconfigure, renew, and basically are responsive to the changes in their environment and to their employees. And of course, the COVID crisis is an example of really having to be flexible and change in response to world events. So let me end with the last slide, which contains a link. Oh, actually, we've got some more findings, sorry. We also looked, and this is, I think, in many ways the most important finding, that when leaders balance compliance risks that arise in pursuit of new business with effective mitigation measures and controls, there's a lot of benefits. When employees see that happening, they're 4.3 times more likely to question decisions if they conflict with organizational values. They're 3.8 times more likely to do the right thing, even if it's not in their personal best interest. For example, meet a scheduled priority when they know that whatever they're working on isn't ready or isn't safe for customers. And they're 3.2 times more likely to speak up or speak out, even in front of managers. So those are some of the additional benefits that you see once you get the basic dynamics of a strong ethical culture in place. And Chelsea, if you can go to the last slide. And this basically tallies and is consistent with government guidance, which has gotten much more detailed and proactive in the last couple of years, where basically regulators are looking at whether you have a culture of ethics and compliance, not just whether you have checked the box and you have various program elements such as a code or training or hotline. It's what do they do in practice? What do they do together? Do you actually have a program, or do you just have elements of a program? So I would urge everybody to take a look at our program effectiveness report. One of the other things we feature and focus on this year is the importance of knitting together all of those elements so that they work together to create a good ethical program. So with that, let me turn to Nancy and Tom. And Nancy, if I can start out with you, tell us a little bit about, I know Henry Schein is a major medical device and healthcare solution provider, but tell us how your role has changed or not as the Chief Compliance Officer and about some of the challenges that you're facing today.
Sure. Thanks very much, Susan, and to LRN and Ethisphere again for organizing today, and for all of you out there, the silent majority out there who are choosing to attend to join us. Thanks so much. Just to put my remarks in context, this slide tells us a little bit about my company, Henry Schein. Henry Schein is a global Fortune 500 company. We have operations in 31 countries. We're the largest distributor to dentists and physicians. The next time you go to your dentist's office or doctor's office, if you look at the brand on the gloves and some of the other products, you may see the Henry Schein name. We sell about 300,000 products manufactured by thousands of manufacturers. And yes, we sell PPE and COVID tests. We're a health distributor, products and services. And we're happy to say we've been in Ethisphere, World's Most Ethical Company, for 9 consecutive years since we started. We have about 19,000, more than 19,000 Team Schein members. That's what we call our employees. And the compliance group, to give you context, we're 13 dedicated compliance folks, about 11 in New York, a couple who are dotted line in the EU, just focusing on GDPR and privacy. But we partner with liaisons and stewards in all of our global business units in key risk areas. So that's the context for who we are. And Susan, to your question about what's different, we normally, being a global company, we normally work mainly by email and phone with global contacts. So that's actually similar. That hasn't really changed. We also do work in person more with folks who are corporate support or some of the business leaders at our headquarters. But most of our business leaders are really in various places around the world, and email is very frequent in our culture. So that hasn't changed a whole lot either. What's most different is within our own compliance team, because we are mainly together in New York. We do frequently stop by each other's desks. And so now what's changed is we're using FaceTime or Skype, as many I'm sure on this call are, for individual and team meetings versus in person. But another thing that happened is we are having more frequent team meetings. We normally had once a month a meeting where members would formally report on progress, on initiatives and projects, share challenges, progress, and we'd have a key speaker from another department in our company so that our folks would be learning even more depth about other functions, and we would be brainstorming about how we collaborate together. So we continued that speaker actually even after we went to work at home off-site over a month ago. But what we did differently is when I asked the team during a team meeting, is there something they'd like that would be helpful in this whole new reality? They really they wanted a social component. They wanted to meet more frequently. And so we did that. We continue our more formal once a month, but in between we're having weekly meetings where we share tips, challenges, our activities in the new reality. We had someone ask about others' hobbies during one of those meetings, and someone mentioned stargazing as pollution has gone on down. And I'll just mention, we were surprised this past week when a team member gave us our own private concert. She apparently has had time to practice piano on the weekends now that she's home. And she did a beautiful, complex rendition of Over the Rainbow, of course, symbolizing getting beyond tough times. So that was a really nice thing to see.
Well, thanks, Nancy. That's very inspiring. And we're seeing in a lot of organizations that people are really coming together and having more contact remotely as a way of supporting each other and getting through the crisis together. If I can go to Tom's first slide, and Tom, if you could give an overview of AES, which is a critical provider to the power system and grid, that would be terrific, and tell us how things have changed for you.
Sure, happy to. So AES is a Fortune 500 energy company. We own and operate power plants in 14 countries throughout the world. That is our core business, developing power generation facilities. Traditional coal and LNG, thermal-based generation, moving more in the last couple of years to renewable energy sources, solar, wind, and developing new lines of business. Battery-based energy storage, we're the world's leading provider of utility-grade batteries, which are revolutionizing the energy industry. We've developed a liquefied natural gas business, and we're very active in creating new digital solutions for our customers to create energy efficiency solutions. AES has been around for about 40 years now, and we were founded as and continue to be a values-based company. So you see our five values there on the right: safety, integrity, excellence, agility, fun. And if you walk the halls at AES, you will hear these repeated all the time because they really are a key part of our culture at AES that has served us very well over the last 40 years, as well as how we deal with this pandemic situation. Safety in particular, given our industry dealing with electricity, it is a highly dangerous activity every day at work for our people going out into the field and doing electrical connections and maintenance and dealing with power outages and that sort of thing. So at AES, every large meeting or gathering at the company starts with a safety reminder, which obviously continues through our how we are dealing with this pandemic situation. And our EHS team is really doing a wonderful job addressing the pandemic and how it applies to our company, and they've been very active in how we message around these issues. And the other one that I will touch on that I think is relevant to everyone on this call is the integrity piece. And we are certainly reinforcing that from the compliance perspective as we deal with this situation. So in terms of how the pandemic is influencing and affecting the way that we work in the compliance department at AES, largely things are running as they would normally. I see that all areas of our compliance program are functioning more or less the way they would normally if we were in the office. So investigations continue to move along. We continue to do third-party due diligence on our vendors and our M&A targets and our business development projects and our joint ventures. I think there are tweaks that we have to make, particularly on due diligence. Things tend to be a little bit slower as we have to check with third-party sources. They're a little more difficult to reach nowadays. So we're addressing that through making sure that we communicate closely with the relevant internal stakeholders to make sure that they understand the timing of how our reviews are going. And largely the other groups are dealing with the same sorts of issues as well. But I think back to when this pandemic really started to affect our business and we went to a work from home environment. I think many people probably experienced the same thing where, on a Friday, I guess 5.5 weeks ago now, the world seemed to really change on a dime within an 8-hour period. Thinking back on it, it was the day I believe that the NBA canceled their season, and so many things happened that day. And I remember going into the office, obviously everyone understood that we were entering into a new world, but it was amazing how quickly things changed that day. And I remember walking out the door that evening, and a number of us were grabbing things from the office thinking that we may be working from home for a few days and bouncing back and forth between work and home. But then the weekend passing and getting to Monday and realizing that we weren't going back to the office anytime soon. So my team, we had a meeting on that Monday. We have a group of about 50 compliance professionals around the world, about half of whom are dedicated compliance professionals and about half of whom split their time between compliance and legal or other functions. And we got everyone on the phone and we spent a couple hours talking through the impacts of this situation on how we viewed our work might go forward. And I think for the large part, we assessed that given current technology and business practices, that we would continue to be able to move forward. And for the most part, that's held. We've made adjustments here or there, particularly with regard to some of our training initiatives that we were planning in person. Those are getting deferred to the second half of the year. But so far, so good. Things are running well.
That's an impressive story, Tom, and Nancy as well, because what I'm hearing is that in both your organizations, you were able to pivot and to maintain a robust compliance program with some tweaks, while at the same time taking care of your teams so that people felt that they were part of a team and able to continue their work. And obviously communication is a huge part of that. Last week we had a webcast hosted by my colleague, Ben DiPietro, and one of the chief ethics and compliance officers said that they've changed from business as usual to business as us, stressing the importance of community. Are your key messages evolving in a similar way? Nancy, do you want to start?
Oh, sure, thanks. If we can just go back one slide, if that's okay.
Yep.
For us, our message, this slide, folks, just represents our compliance team motto. And what we have is the 3 C's. This has been long established: communicate, collaborate, continuously improve, and also be an integrity partner. It's in our sign-off, it's in our materials, etc. So communication, collaboration, continuously learning and improving is part of what our focus has always been. So yes, communication is really key. I've mentioned before some of the ways that we're doing this now by Skype and FaceTime instead of in person or email as a team, and how we're continuing to work similar way though with our clients as we have in the past. And we're not adding a fourth C for COVID to our motto. We're keeping our 3. But this approach has really been key for us to operationalizing compliance, because it recognizes, in essence, the effect of a partnership. I think, Susan, similar to what you've mentioned, Ben's our us concept, that's what it's about, relationship building and trust building. It's based on communication and listening and sharing thoughts, coming to a fair resolution after understanding facts, after understanding our clients' potential concerns, and continually learning and improving. So I think the basics, frankly, human nature has not changed from before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. And I think that, yes, it's true. Communication, collaboration, continuous improvement, it stays the same. You know, we have the same goals also that we've had all along. And we focus on that when we have our team meetings, remind ourselves, keep the eyes on the prize. We still have the same goals. We still have the same human nature.
Thanks, Nancy. Tom, do you want to
Yeah,
address?
I think it's a similar situation for us, and Nancy touched on this already earlier, but we're experiencing a very similar phenomenon where we are, I think, actually communicating more frequently than we did when we were in the office. That I think in large part is intended to compensate for the informal communications that aren't happening any longer. The water cooler conversations, the running into people accidentally in the hall, the casual conversations over lunch, those aren't happening, or at least aren't happening as frequently. So, we have replaced that with more frequent outreach. Similar to what Nancy is doing, our compliance team is having more regularly scheduled meetings than we did in the past. We are a very tight-knit group that is very used to, for the team in Arlington, Virginia, at our headquarters, we all 4 of us sit right together, and hundreds, if not thousands of times a day, we just pop in and chat with each other about issues, and we don't have that ability anymore. So now we have many more frequent scheduled meetings, as well as the quick reach out to address a quick issue here and there. Same thing with our global team, but we're also making a point to reach out more to our business partners to make sure that we understand the issues that they're dealing with, to try and identify any pain points, risk issues that we need to be on top of, things that we may not be thinking about, or that may not be a traditional part of our business. For example, like a lot of companies, AES has really ramped up its charitable giving over the last month to try and make sure that we are providing support to our local communities. So, that ranges from donating masks and other PPE that we have on stock at our facilities to local healthcare organizations, hospitals, and so forth, monetary donations to hospitals and other relief organizations. And within our compliance program, every one of those charitable contributions need to be reviewed and approved by the compliance department in advance of being offered or made. And our CSR, or our stakeholder management teams, are doing a really masterful job of trying to identify needs and support them locally. And rather than trying to, sit back and wait for those to come, we are being a bit more proactive in this situation and make sure that we're working with them, from the get-go, identifying those things so that we can complete our review and approval process as quickly as possible, so that we're not holding up any of that aid. That's just an example of one way that we're trying to be more proactive these days, and making sure that we're adaptive to the business and supporting them properly.
Thanks, Tom. And it's interesting too, the need for contact and the need for community. Jason Gay, who writes for the Wall Street Journal and is usually pretty humorous, wrote a column about how he used to hate meetings and now he loves them. And we're seeing that LRN's a small company, but our CEO, David Greenberg, is hosting weekly all hands calls that pretty much everybody attends. And we have meditation workshops and wellness workshops and groups for parents with small kids imprisoned in small houses or apartments. And it's really brought our community even more together, even though we can't physically interact with one another. So let's turn to one of the other more challenging aspects of coping with the crisis with resilience, and that's pressure. I was on a call with Partnering Against Corruption Initiative, which is out of the World Economic Forum 2 weeks ago. And some of the chief ethics and compliance officers were talking about pressure to redirect supplies to customers and give priority, which would be providing an improper advantage in a number of instances, and how that was really creating a fair amount of challenge. Are you seeing during the crisis that there is more pressure on your workforce? And if so, how are you coping with that? Nancy or Tom?
Sure. I think there's certainly people feel more pressure financially, health pressure, health concerns. In our organization, I guess one of the pressures has been because we do sell products that are so needed, the PPE and the COVID tests particularly are brand new. So there has been, of course, urgency. That's really, I have to say, the company response has reflected the best of a team coming together in urgency, hard work and teamwork and great communication, because we've had to expedite getting arrangements done in order to get this out. I strongly believe, though, if there's a solid foundation of ethical conduct, Susan, this is what you were saying in the beginning, and values that have been built, together with the idea everyone's responsible for compliance, that is, the ethical culture is the most important element for a strong compliance program. And that's what's the great foundation, if that's been put in place for years, working for years before any kind of crisis like this. And so the other thing I'll say, though, is I have reached out in the times of stress. Tom, I think you mentioned this too. I have reached out to the heads of sales, realizing that folks out in the field may feel financial pressures. Maybe they're trying to get creative out there with what they're doing, and that we need to be, and they're out of the usual routine of what they're used to. People may have distractions of fears of COVID and otherwise. And so reaching out and maintaining that communication under the times of pressure is particularly important, reminding sales leaders to be on the alert for anything that does sound, like it's something we should be partnering on and should be aware of and supporting.
That's a great example of operationalizing ethics and compliance. Tom, are you seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I could go through every organization in our company, and I think everyone is dealing with their own unique pressures. One I guess I would highlight would be the pressure that our business development teams are dealing with. Like any company, we have targets that we are aiming to achieve by the end of the year in terms of development and expansion of the company and all of that. Obviously all of those targets were set before the pandemic hit, and now people are dealing with a situation where it's much more challenging to develop new projects than it was a month or two ago. What we see our teams doing to address this is they're chasing more projects than they normally would, understanding that it's going to be harder to get a project through to fruition in these times when you have so many stakeholders who need to be involved and approve or contribute. There are supply chain issues, there are regulatory issues. Developing an infrastructure project in normal times is very difficult, and now it's exceptionally difficult. We see our teams, particularly in certain markets, working on more projects than they typically would, which creates more work for the compliance organization, because we need to keep up with that and make sure that we are doing the level of review and analysis and due diligence that we would for any other project. So again, it all comes back to communication and making sure that we are tied at the hip with our business development teams, checking in with them regularly. The worst case scenario here from a risk perspective is it creates leverage for an unsavory party outside of the company to try and extract some sort of improper benefit from the company, recognizing the situation and the pressures that people are under. So, our business development teams are savvy enough to recognize that, and I don't think they necessarily need that explicit reminder to be aware of those situations. But I think just the continued outreach to those folks is helpful, so that it's top of mind. And everyone is working so fast and so hard at these times that whatever support that we can provide them is essential from my perspective.
Well, I think those are two great examples of chief ethics and compliance officers who have successfully operationalized their program and built a strong culture. So as you said, Tom, you don't necessarily have to remind them continuously because they know, but you're there to help. And Nancy described the same dynamic going on. Turning to the question of differences and ways of coping during the COVID crisis, again, on our webcast last week that Ben hosted, one of the CECOs talked about, she called it a tale of two cities, where some EC programs were fading into the background to get out of the way of business and not to be an annoyance, whereas others were pivoting and rising to the challenge and being part of the response. And clearly you fall into that latter category. But are you seeing differences, for example, in training, or with how do you deal with office visits that can no longer take place by not just your team members, but other colleagues? Nancy, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. Training. We actually did the first week we were out, we started hearing it might be a good idea to roll out training. We normally, our training program, we do in person, as Tom was mentioning, his organization does too, but we also have e-learning. With 19,000 folks, Team Schein members, we have a broad range to get out to. And we normally roll out those trainings one each month with vacations in August and December. And instead, the request was, because there was so much uncertainty about how people would be working from home, what was going to happen, was business going to drop due to the pandemic? A lot of our customers' offices have been closed, or at least partially closed. And so we started brainstorming with HR about accelerating the rollout. We reached out to our HR colleagues who help us with training globally in other languages, other jurisdictions. And we decided to go ahead and accelerate the rollout, give people the same due dates as they had before, so they didn't have to get them all done, but they had an opportunity to accelerate and get trainings done earlier. And it's generally been very good feedback. We're going to, after doing this, it was an unintended experiment. As it turned out, we're going to survey folks to see if this should be a going forward improvement in the program and whether we should continue it next year. And the other thing,
that's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
It's okay. The office visit I've already addressed, but I will mention that we did put together what we've called our compliance dispatch, and reinforcing communication again out there, reinforcing compliance awareness in the general organization, reminding people of resources that they have, and our helpline. And we'll see, we may continue that on after we all get over this stage. We may continue at least that title on the dispatch.
Yeah, I'd like to do this again in 9 months' time and see, what you've kept and what's changed. But Tom, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. And I would say that our approach at AES with regard to training and communication, during the pandemic is still a work in progress. And we are really still evaluating how we are doing things differently and rethinking, conclusions that we made a month ago about what we might and might not be able to do. So, we're continuing to shift our thinking here. We've obviously had to make some adjustments. We typically, as a company, try to do as much of our training in person as we can. And we had a couple in-person training programs that were scheduled for the first half of the year that we at least a month ago, had decided to postpone into the second half of the year. Although we're now reevaluating that because we are finding that communicating by video conference has been so effective that we think we might be able to pull some of the training off online. You know, I have to give a real shout out to our technology team at AES, who switched us over to Office 365 last year and implemented Microsoft Teams in the last couple months, which the timing of it was perfect. And I have to admit that I am a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to communication technology. And up until 5 weeks ago, I never ever used video conferencing, and I did all of my telephone calls by conference call and was on the phone, and typically would be distracted, you know, reading emails as I was on the phone. And having gone to a work from home environment, I've done a complete 180 on this and now insist that all calls be online and by video. And it's been so effective that, you know, when we talked about it as a team a month ago, we decided to put off in-person training until the second half of the year. But now we're reevaluating that because I think we could be effective doing it by teams. You know, but we're still making adjustments. One of our most successful communications or training programs that we have is a program called Ethics Champions, where we bring together small groups of people, 10 or 15 at a time, for discussions about ethical dilemmas and their issues. Sometimes they deal with AES business issues, sometimes they're issues that are pulled out of the news, and we're even contemplating for the next session using some of the real life ethical dilemmas posed by the coronavirus epidemic for discussion. You know, there are situations that don't have right or wrong answers, but we bring people together for an hour at a time to sit down and talk through a real life ethical dilemma. And the purpose of that exercise is just to get people talking about ethical issues, ethical dilemmas, and create and foster an environment where people feel not just comfortable speaking up, but encouraged to do that and to raise ethical issues. You know, we've been doing that program for 12 years or more, and it's one of our employees, you know, favorite compliance related activities. We'll probably continue to move that into the second half of the year. We were going to do that second quarter. You know, I think that's one situation where having people in person, assuming that we'll be able to do that in the second half of the year, is more powerful than even trying to do it by video. You know, so we're reevaluating this on a daily basis, and you know, what we're focused on for the time being is really some sort of shorter, more direct messaging, just as reminders of our company's values and our ethical principles. You know, people are being inundated with so much information right now. You know, I want to make things quick, easy, and digestible for the time being, and we'll save some of the heavier stuff down the road.
Thanks. That's again a great example from both of you of pivoting and being flexible and staying relevant, and really assisting people in continuing to feel part of an ethical culture. Tom, you got a question that just came in, and I'd like to pose it to both of you. And then I do want to turn to some examples from your companies of employees going above and beyond. But the question is that you mentioned that sales teams, you know, obviously have their quotas, and they're in some cases casting a wider net so that they can continue to be successful. But are you also at the same time adjusting financial targets that you set before the pandemic? And how are you doing that, if so? Because nobody really knows how this is going to turn out. If you could talk about that, and then Nancy could talk about that from the Henry Schein perspective, I think that would be very useful for people on the phone.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we have officially announced any revisions at this point. I think that's obviously something that management for the company will have to look at, whether those same targets are achievable or not. And I imagine that's an ongoing discussion at the management level. Although to be completely frank, I'm not part of those conversations, so I can't weigh in on that much. But I think, everyone recognizes, not just at my company, but at every company, that there are going to be, adjustments. That 2020 is not going to be the year that we expected on January 1.
For sure. Nancy?
Yeah, I'll say the same. That's just, that's just natural. We haven't had an official announcement either, but what we have had is, all companies everywhere are facing financial pressures to cut costs. So that's what we've had. And our company has very quickly also announced quite a while ago about automatic cuts to management. Our CEO quickly volunteered to take no salary, and proportional cuts were made for leadership, going down to the director level, proportional, so that the higher you were, the bigger your cut was. And to me, that was a real ethical statement of shouldering more pain for the team benefit. So it hasn't been, we haven't focused on the targets for other folks. We have, of course, all had to look at ways we can save money and cut costs. So that's been the toughest thing, one of the toughest things during this whole time.
But that also speaks volumes about your leadership, that they're willing to do that. So that we don't run out of time, and we also have another question that I'd like to focus on in a minute. Can you talk about some of the ways your employees have gone above and beyond? When we had our pre-brief call for this webinar, I was really inspired by some of the stories you've told about people doing things that they're not required to do, but that they're doing out of a commitment to ethical culture and to serving the communities and the stakeholders that you have. Tom, do you want to start off with that?
Yeah, happy to. And I think those things are happening at a variety of levels at AES. And I'll start at the top, because I think our CEO and our management team have really done a phenomenal job communicating with the company on the whole variety of issues that are being raised by this pandemic. When we went to a work from home environment, actually before we even went, the week before we went to a work from home environment, our CEO announced a company-wide address via Microsoft Teams, where he set aside 2 hours in English, 2 hours in Spanish, and another one in Portuguese. He's multilingual, to give our employees an update on how the pandemic was affecting our business, but also to answer questions. And he has kept that up in each of the last 5 weeks, and spends 2 hours at a time every Friday giving an update and answering people's questions. And the communication has really been phenomenal. And even in the last couple of weeks, 2 weeks ago, he brought in Dr. Ashish Jha from Harvard University's School of Public Health, who came on and answered people's health-related questions related to the pandemic for over an hour. Last week, we had Dr. Barbara Stanley from Columbia University's Department of Psychology come in and answer questions related to mental health and how to keep a positive attitude and keep your spirits up during this period. So, management, the CEO, they've been incredibly supportive. Our environmental health and safety team has really been phenomenal throughout all of this, communicating safety tips, setting forth really great protocols on restricting entry to our facilities to make sure that people are not getting exposed, putting in place business contingency plans at our generation facilities. We generate electricity, and if our people can't show up, that means the lights go out, that hospitals don't have electricity. It's critical that we keep those plants running. So we've developed business contingency plans where our operators are committing to living at the plant for 2-week periods at a time and not going home to make sure that they're not exposed to coronavirus and we can keep the lights on. And if we've activated that at a couple locations, we've got it ready to go if we needed it at a couple others. So, the rally around the company and a lot of great things going on at many levels.
That's really inspiring. Nancy?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. That's terrific what the company's doing out. In our case, going beyond what I mentioned before about sharing the pain, our CEO also, we have normally management meetings quarterly, and it just so happened the management meeting was shortly after the, Tom, as you put it, that precipitous change, sudden change. And we also had speakers come. We had a professor and psychoanalyst come and talk about the impact too. And we had usual business speakers also. We've had webinars arranged for our customers to help them with dealing with lots of different aspects, including financial aspects under all of the recent legislation and loans, and including the psychological aspects, the team aspects for their teams, and a number of other type of topics gotten into. There's a greater interest in telemedicine at this time too. There was a speaker on that. So that was of interest. And we've just going above and beyond it's mainly been our HR team more than our compliance team that put out regular publications, I'll put it, communications. On Mondays, it's the Monday Pick Me Up, and we have our creative team actually of our company, creating inspiring videos. And we have teams sharing customer and other gratitude for going the extra mile. And then we have a Tuesday washing hands post is what it's called in our place, which is entertaining and more along the lines of sharing different tips. And then our CEO also and other leadership communications continue as well.
It sounds like you're really keeping your community connected and engaged and giving them a lot of support. I'm going to pivot because we've gotten some questions in particular about, Tom, you mentioned ethics champions.
Sure.
And people are interested to know whether those program discussions are available to everyone in the organization. And do you use them as part of a broader knowledge management program? And also, they're interested to know who are the ethics champions and who actually selects them, and how often do you meet, and basically how do you do that whole function?
Sure, great questions, and happy to address them. Our Ethics Champions program is really a standalone. It's not necessarily directly tied to, a specific training initiative. We try and keep it separate from some of the other, more formal training programs that we have. Where we're not necessarily trying to convey knowledge about a particular policy or law or requirement. They're more generalized conversations. In terms of how we run it, the program derives its name from the group facilitators who we refer to as ethics champions. So, I already mentioned that we tend to run these conversations in small groups, typically 10 or 15 people, no more than 20. We don't like the groups to be too big because that tends to inhibit people from participating in the conversation, and we want everyone to participate. It's certainly open to everyone in the company. We typically have one or more ethics champions identified at each of our businesses. They tend not to be people from the compliance department. Our preference is that they're not part of the compliance program. One, because, for a variety of reasons. One being is, we want the compliance program to be viewed as broader than just the 30 or 50 people who have an official compliance title behind their names. But we want it to be viewed as a much more broad-based program. We also want to make sure that we're encouraging people to participate in the discussion, and we don't want them to feel like they are being judged by a compliance officer whether they're getting the answer right or wrong, because we purposely choose scenarios that are very challenging where there isn't a right or wrong answer. There is no clear answer. They're very gray issues, and the point is to get active discussion, which we're usually pretty successful on. So it's open to all of our people, all 10,000 of our people. You know, we typically get close to 50% participation across the company. So,
Wow.
you know, at each of our businesses, we offer multiple sessions. We usually try to keep similar people together in the conversation. So we'll have a separate session for senior managers, and then, you know, handle, you know, line level employees in a different group, because, you know, if there's too much of a power dynamic, the you know, the lower level people tend not to be as willing to speak up. So, but we have, over the years, I mentioned we've been running this program for at least 12 years now. Every time we run the program, which we typically do twice a year, sometimes it's once, depending on our program, we develop 3 or 4 new scenarios that we add to our library. And we keep the entire library available. I think we probably have close to 100 scenarios at this point. And the ethics champion who's running the discussion can choose which scenario they want to use. Sometimes we require that they use a specific scenario because there might be a point that we're trying to drive home or a particular focus, but for the most part, they can pick and choose.
Wow, that's a very impressive use of ethics champions. We're almost out of time, but Nancy, another question's come in that I'd like you to answer if you could, which is, one of the participants has asked, how do you plan your compliance program in these days of uncertainty? How flexible, how dynamic? What are the things that can't change, and the essentials? And so how are you handling that going forward?
Sure. I mean, the essentials are, we go by the DOJ, Department of Justice Guidelines for Compliance Programs. That's kind of the standard. So all of the normal compliance functions we expect to continue on. We've been fortunate. We have, you know, our members working. As I said, we're used to doing things remotely, normally not from home. We see each other more frequently at the office, but we work with our global colleagues and our global clients. And so planning, the flexibility part has had to be that some things may take a little longer. Some things in some areas, there may not be the same resources. There may be supervening COVID priorities in our case too. So some things may have to, the timeline, we may have to be more flexible with. But frankly, that happens normally. We are weekly and monthly as different projects and come into play across the company. So I have to say, I'm sorry that, you know, I don't know how helpful that is to the questioner, and Tom may have additional ideas, but with us, we keep, as I said before, we keep our eyes on the plan. We see we still have the same purpose. We still have the same aims as before, because we're out of the office. We're working from a different place. And because resources may be impacted, we have to take that into consideration. But otherwise, we see it that we continue on with the same focus, the same aims that we had before.
Yeah, I think very similar for us, Nancy. You know, we have our annual plan that we set back in January at the beginning of the year. We are still aiming to complete that plan by the end of the year, but we're being flexible in how we go about it. And as a team, we pull that out, I think, every 2 weeks or so, and reevaluate the timing and the sequencing, but the goal is to complete the plan.
Well, it makes sense to stay the course and to keep the focus. I must say, this has been one of the most inspiring sessions that I've had the privilege to attend and participate in. And both of you deserve a tremendous amount of credit for keeping your teams together, helping your organizations cope, and doing the right thing, even if it's not something that's absolutely required. I think that probably everybody on the phone finds this as inspiring as I do. So I think we've got 1 minute left. Chelsea, do you have anything in closing that you'd like to stress?
Sure, thanks, Susan. Yeah, just to remind everybody that we did record today's session, and once it is available, I'll be sending it to you via email as well as the slides. And if you have any questions that you'd like to ask Nancy, Thomas, or Susan afterwards, don't hesitate to reach out. I'd be more than happy to connect you.
Great. Well, I want to thank Ethisphere for giving us the opportunity to spend time together as a community and consider important and topical issues. And I hope that everybody stays safe. And I look forward in 9 months or less to connecting again. And perhaps we can have a return session to look at what we've talked about today and how that's playing out over the long term. So thank you, Nancy, and thank you, Tom, and thanks, Ethisphere.
Thank you.
All.
Bye-bye all.